The morning of my 18th birthday, my stepmother slid a garbage bag across the kitchen floor and told me I had 24 hours to disappear. There was no argument. No dramatic confrontation. She said it the way someone might read a grocery list, flat, certain, already moving on to the next item in her mind. The bag landed near my feet with a soft thud, and I stood there in the kitchen I had eaten breakfast in for 11 years, staring at the condensation ring her coffee mug had left on the counter, and I understood that the conversation was already over before I opened my mouth. No cake. No candles. Just the sound of a zipper and her voice saying the house was never mine to begin with. She wasn't wrong about that part. The house had been hers in every way that mattered, her furniture, her rules, her silences that filled every room like weather. My father had bought it for her 3 years after my mother passed, when I was 7 and he was trying to build something new out of something broken. I never blamed him for that. He was a quiet man who expressed love through presence rather than words, and for years his presence was enough. But then the cough started. By the time I was 15, he was driving himself to appointments he didn't mention and coming home looking slightly more tired than the day before. He never complained. He never sat me down and explained what was happening in careful language the way the books say parents should. He simply continued, making coffee in the morning, leaving for work, coming home, sitting in his chair by the window with maps and notebooks spread across his lap the way he always had. I would watch him from the hallway sometimes, that stillness he carried, and think that some people hold entire worlds inside them that no one ever gets to see. He passed the winter I turned 17. My stepmother wore black for 3 weeks and then redecorated the living room. I don't say that with bitterness, I say it because it told me everything I needed to understand about what came next. There was no cruelty in her, not exactly. There was simply an accounting, a quiet recalculation of what she had signed up for and what she was now left with. A teenage boy who looked like his father. A reminder of a chapter she was ready to close. I watched her move through the house those months after his death with the focused energy of someone rearranging their life, and I understood, without anyone saying so, that I was one of the things being rearranged. The garbage bag on my birthday was simply the final sentence of a paragraph she had been writing for a year. I packed what fit, 2 changes of clothes, my father's old field jacket that still smelled faintly of pine resin and something metallic I could never name, a phone charger, and a paperback I'd never finished. I left the rest. There wasn't much that felt worth carrying. I drove away in a 2003 Honda Civic with a passenger seat held together with duct tape and $214 in my bank account, and I told myself the thing you tell yourself when you are 18 and the road ahead is the only thing wider than the hole behind you, that this was the beginning of something, not the end. What I didn't know yet was how completely true that was. I made it to Reno because Reno was 3 hours away and I knew a guy from school who was crashing with his uncle in an apartment complex off the freeway. He said I could sleep on the floor for a few days. The floor was concrete under thin carpet and the uncle worked nights and came home at 4 in the morning talking loudly on the phone, but it was shelter, and shelter at 18 feels like something close to grace. I spent those first 3 days doing the math that every person without a safety net learns to do. What jobs were hiring? What I could eat for under $6. Whether the Civic's check engine light was serious or the kind you could ignore for another 3,000 miles. I applied to 12 places in 2 days, restaurants, warehouses, a tire shop on Virginia Street whose owner looked at me for a long moment before saying he'd call me by Friday. He didn't call. I was sitting in the parking lot of a dollar store on the 3rd evening, eating a sleeve of crackers and watching the sun drop behind the Sierra Nevada like something being slowly swallowed, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. A 775 area code. Local. I almost didn't answer. The man on the other end introduced himself as a county attorney, not the kind who prosecutes people, he clarified immediately, as if he'd made that distinction before. Estate law. He had been trying to reach me for several weeks, he said, and asked if I was the son of a man whose full name I hadn't heard spoken aloud since the funeral. Something happened in my chest when he said it. Not grief exactly, something quieter and more complicated, the way a room feels when you open it after a long time and the air inside is still arranged the way someone left it. He told me there was a matter of inheritance. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I was sitting in a parking lot eating crackers 3 days after being handed a garbage bag, and the word inheritance sounded like it belonged to a different species of person entirely. I asked him if he had the right number. He read my full name back to me. He had the right number. He explained it carefully, the way people do when they know the information is unusual and they don't want the listener to hang up. My father had filed the paperwork years before his death, quietly, through an attorney in a county 2 hours east of where we lived, in a jurisdiction that had nothing to do with the house or the life my stepmother knew about. He had done it deliberately. Separately. He had kept it entirely apart from everything else, which is why no one had found it during the estate process, and why my stepmother had walked through the last year believing the accounting was complete. It was not complete. Buried in the legal language, past the whereas and the party of the first parts, was a single line that stopped my breath when the attorney read it aloud. A sealed cave on 40 acres of Nevada high desert, deeded solely and irrevocably to his son. I sat with the phone against my ear for a moment that felt longer than it was. No explanation accompanied the deed. No letter tucked inside. No recording of his voice saying what I imagine he might have said if he'd been the kind of man who said things out loud. Just coordinates, latitude and longitude written in his handwriting on a piece of paper the attorney had photographed and was offering to email me, and a rusted key taped to the bottom of the envelope with a strip of electrical tape that had dried and curled at the edges. The attorney asked if I had any questions. I had approximately 10,000 questions, but the only one I could form into a sentence was whether it was real. He assured me it was. He said my father had paid the property taxes on it for 22 years. He said the land was clear of any liens or encumbrances. He said it was mine, fully and legally, and that I could do with it whatever I chose. I asked him what was in the cave. He said he didn't know. He said the deed described it only as a sealed natural formation, and that the key in the envelope presumably corresponded to a lock my father had installed himself at some point, though there was no documentation of when or why. He emailed me the photograph. I sat in that parking lot until the sky went fully dark, looking at my father's handwriting on my phone screen. He had precise, careful print, the kind that comes from years of writing small notations in field notebooks in bad lighting. The numbers were neat. The key in the photograph was old and iron and slightly corroded at the bow, the kind of key that looks like it belongs to something that has been waiting a very long time. I thought about my father sitting in that chair by the window, maps across his lap, notebooks filled with things he never explained. I thought about the trips he took when I was young that he described simply as work. I thought about the way he looked at me sometimes, not with the distracted half-attention of a busy parent, but with something focused and particular, the way you look at something you are making sure to remember. I think he always knew there would come a day when I would need something solid to stand on. I think he spent 22 years building it for me in secret. I finished the crackers. I started the Civic. I pulled up the coordinates on my Maps app and watched the blue line draw itself east across the Nevada desert toward a place I had never been, toward a door my father had locked and a key he had saved, toward whatever came next. And what came next changed everything. I drove through the night. Not because I had planned to, I had planned nothing beyond the next hour since the moment that garbage bag hit the kitchen floor, but because once the blue line appeared on my map and the distance read 6 hours and 11 minutes, stopping felt impossible. The desert at night has a way of making the road feel like the only real thing in the world. No buildings. No trees. Just black sky salted with stars and the white dashes of the highway disappearing under my headlights one after another, steady as a heartbeat. I had $214 when I left Reno. I spent $38 on gas at a station outside Elko where a man behind the counter was watching a fishing show on a small television and didn't look up when I walked in. I bought a coffee and a bag of peanuts and stood at the counter doing the math I had already memorized, $176 remaining, a car that needed an oil change 3 months ago, and coordinates on a screen leading me toward something my father had hidden for 22 years. The math should have scared me. It didn't. I think that was the first sign that something had already shifted inside me, though I couldn't have named it then. Some part of me had stopped calculating survival and started moving toward something else, toward an answer to a question I hadn't known I was carrying since the day I watched my father sit quietly by that window with his notebooks and his maps and his particular, patient way of keeping his whole interior world to himself. I reached the coordinates at a few minutes past 4 in the morning. There was nothing to see from the road. That was the first thing I understood. My father had chosen this place, or found this place, with the specific knowledge that it would remain invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. A dirt track left the highway unmarked, no signpost, no reflector, just a gap in the scrub that you would miss completely at 60 miles per hour. I almost missed it at 30. I doubled back, turned onto the track, and drove slowly through the dark with the Civic bottoming out on the ruts my headlights barely reached ahead of me. The granite hillside appeared out of the dark like something surfacing. I stopped the car and sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at it through the windshield. It was a long, low rise of pale rock, unremarkable in every way that a hillside can be unremarkable, no marker, no path worn into the ground, no indication that any human being had ever paid it particular attention. Exactly the way my father would have wanted it. I got out into the cold desert air and walked toward it with my phone flashlight held low. I found the door 20 feet along the base of the rock face, set so flush into the granite that the seam was nearly invisible unless you were standing directly in front of it. Iron, painted the same pale gray as the surrounding stone, hinged into the rock with bolts my father must have set himself. A heavy padlock hung from a hasp that had oxidized to the color of dried blood. I stood there in the dark with the rusted key in my hand and felt something I have tried many times since to describe accurately. It wasn't excitement, exactly. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to the feeling of standing outside a room where someone you love is sleeping, a profound, careful stillness, the sense that whatever you are about to find has been waiting for you specifically, and that it deserves to be approached with the right kind of quiet. The key fit. The lock opened with less resistance than I expected, as if it had been oiled recently, though I knew that was impossible. The door swung inward on hinges that had been maintained, no rust scream, no resistance, and the air that came out was cool and carried a smell I recognized without being able to place immediately. Something mineral. Something ancient. Something that reminded me, in a way I couldn't immediately explain, of my father's field jacket. I stepped inside. The cave was larger than the door suggested. My flashlight reached maybe 30 feet before the walls curved away into darkness, but what it caught in those 30 feet stopped me completely. Along both walls, on shelving my father had built from steel pipe and plywood, were dozens of metal storage cases, the heavy kind with foam-lined interiors, the kind field researchers use for equipment that cannot be damaged. Beside them, in labeled banker's boxes stacked with the same neat precision as his handwriting, were decades of paper records. Notebooks. Binders. Rolled maps in labeled tubes. Core sample trays sealed in plastic, each one tagged with coordinates and dates in that careful print I had last seen in the attorney's photograph. I pulled the nearest notebook from the shelf. The first page was dated 23 years ago. I was not yet born. He had started this before I existed. I sat down on the cave floor with the notebook in my lap and read for 2 hours by flashlight while the desert outside went from black to gray to the pale gold of early Nevada morning. The language was technical, geological survey notation, formation descriptions, sample analysis records, but I had grown up watching him write in these notebooks and I understood enough. He had been mapping this site methodically, return trip by return trip, building a picture of what lay beneath the surface of this hillside and the 40 acres surrounding it with the patience of someone who knew that what he was documenting was significant and that significance required proof. By the time the light outside had changed enough that I didn't need the flashlight, I understood the broad shape of what he had found. A lithium deposit. Not a small one. I am not a geologist. I want to be precise about that, because what followed required people who were. But I had read enough in those 2 hours to understand that my father had spent the better part of 3 decades quietly, carefully, and completely alone documenting something that the mining industry would describe, when they eventually saw his records, as a significant discovery. The core samples alone, 64 years of accumulated evidence, as the attorney later helped me count, represented a body of geological work that professionals who reviewed it afterward said was remarkable not just for what it showed but for the rigor with which it had been assembled. One geologist told me he had worked for major companies his entire career and had never seen private survey documentation this thorough. My father had done all of it alone, on weekends, on the trips he described simply as work, across the entire span of my life and before it. He had told no one. I found the purchase records in a binder near the back wall, the original land acquisition, the tax payment history, the correspondence from 3 separate mining companies that had approached him over the years with offers of increasing size. The letters were polite. The offers were serious. He had declined each one with a single sentence, handwritten on their own letterhead, returned without further explanation. Not available at this time. He had waited. Through my mother's death and his remarriage and his own illness and everything that life placed in front of him, he had continued paying the taxes on this land, maintaining this door, keeping this record, and waiting. The question I kept returning to, sitting on that cave floor with the morning light beginning to reach the entrance, was what exactly he had been waiting for. I think I already knew the answer. I think I had known it since the attorney read his handwriting to me in that parking lot. He had been waiting for me to need it. Not just to inherit it, anyone can inherit land. He had been waiting for the moment when I would be standing fully on my own, with nothing underneath me, at the exact age when a person discovers what they are actually made of. He had arranged it this way deliberately. Separate jurisdiction. Separate attorney. Sealed away from everything my stepmother would have found. He had made sure that what he left me could not be taken by someone else's accounting of what I deserved. It took 14 months from that morning to the closing. There were geologists and attorneys and conversations I didn't fully understand and documents I signed in rooms that felt very different from parking lots outside dollar stores in Reno. The mineral rights evaluation alone took 4 months. I lived carefully during that time. The tire shop owner on Virginia Street had called back, eventually, and I worked there 6 days a week and said nothing to anyone about what was happening, because my father had taught me, without ever stating it as a lesson, that the most valuable things are the ones you protect with silence until the moment arrives to let them speak. The moment arrived on a Tuesday in a conference room with large windows overlooking downtown Reno. The number was real. It remains real. I will not write it here because it still feels like something that belongs to a private conversation between my father and me, conducted across whatever distance exists between the living and the dead. My stepmother called twice after the local paper ran a small item about the mineral rights sale. I was at work when the first call came. I was having lunch when the second one came. I finished my lunch. My father never raised his voice. Not once in all the years I watched him move quietly through his life, maintaining his records, paying his taxes, declining his offers, watching me from across rooms with that particular focused attention that I understand now was not distraction but devotion. He had simply loved me in the most durable language he knew, in deeds filed carefully, in keys saved, in 40 acres of Nevada desert that he held onto across 22 years of a world that kept asking him to let go. He planned. He was patient. And in the end, his silence said everything.